The prison beneath the sky. Point of view, Iden. The mountains were not made for men. Not these ones. They clawed at the sky like frozen beasts, their peaks drowned in clouds and silence. Wind here didn't whisper, it screamed. Iden sat against the cold stone wall, chains biting into his wrists, and wondered for the 100th time why the gods hated him. He'd been a blacksmith. Simple work. Fire and metal, hammer and steel. He hadn't wanted to fight for the border wars, hadn't cared about the Empire's land disputes. But his forge was too close to the edge of it all, and when the Valrothi riders came, they didn't ask questions. Now, he was here. Cell 47, Block 7. A prison carved into the belly of Mount Morak. No sun. No time. Just screams, groans, and cold so deep it felt like it would eat his bones. But that wasn't the strangest part. No, the strangest part was the cell across from his, always silent. Always guarded. Twice a day, a guard came with food and said nothing. He opened the hatch, slid in a tray, then left. Never a word. Never a response. Iden had tried to peek once, through the narrow slit between the bars. He saw only long, silver hair tangled in knots and a wrist shackled with blackened iron. Whoever she was, she hadn't moved. Until today. It started with a hum. Soft, barely audible under the howling wind outside. Iden blinked, sitting up straighter, ignoring the ache in his back. The hum again, coming from the silent cell. "You're awake," he said, not expecting an answer. The humming stopped. A pause. Then a voice, low and cracked from disuse, floated out like smoke. "You are new." Iden leaned closer. "Not that new. Been here a while." "Name's Iden." A moment of silence. Then, "That name means fire-bearer in Old Liran." "Does it?" "Never knew." Another pause. "You should not speak to me." He smirked despite himself. "Why? Planning to curse me?" A soft exhale. Not quite a laugh. Not quite a sigh. "I already did. Long ago." Her name, he would learn later, was Naira. She would not say her title. Not then. Not yet. Just Naira. They spoke in bits. Fragments. Words shared like stolen coals between frostbitten fingers. She asked about the world. About the war. He told her what he knew, about the fall of cities, the burning of archives, the rise of warlords. About how no one remembered the old kings anymore. Only hunger. Only ash. "Good," she said once, barely above a whisper. "Let it all burn." Iden had asked her then, "What did they do to you?" She didn't answer. But he heard the chains creak. He heard her shiver. And something in him, something stubborn and stupid, stirred. He wanted to fix her. Days passed. Maybe weeks. He stopped counting. Naira began asking more. About Iden. His forge. His village. The smell of pine smoke. The taste of roasted apples. Little things. He told her everything. And then she asked, "Why do you talk to me?" Iden shrugged. "Because you're real. I was a queen once," she said softly. "And then, I broke." He didn't know what to say. So he just said, "Then let's fix you." He started passing her bits of metal he stole from the food trays. Shaped them with his hands, teeth, nails. Tiny links, twisted into symbols. The first was a bird. The next, a flame. Then a flower. He pushed them through the slit beneath her door. She said nothing, but each time, they disappeared. Until one day, she passed something back. A ring. Made from her chain. Smoothed and shaped with care. It pulsed faintly, warm. "This is old magic," she whispered. "It belongs to you now." "What does it do?" "Reminds me I'm not alone." Aiden didn't sleep much that night. He kept the ring on a cord around his neck. And for the first time since the chains had closed on his wrists, he didn't feel like they'd won. Something was changing. Not just in the prison. In her. In him. Fate, it seemed, wasn't done with either of them. The storm came like a memory, loud, aching, and impossible to ignore. Naira sat with her back to the cold wall of her cell, eyes closed, chains wound around her like a second skin. Above her, the mountain groaned. Snow and rock pelted the outer walls, but she no longer flinched at the sounds. Storms were familiar. Storms were almost comforting. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't alone in the dark. The man, Aiden, was humming again. She could hear him across the corridor, low and steady like a forge whispering before it turned into a roar. Firebearer, she thought. A name like that used to mean something in her world. It marked a person chosen by the fates. Those who carried fire in their veins weren't just smiths or soldiers, they were sparks destined to light something bigger. She had ignored that kind of meaning for so long. She had to, or the grief would have drowned her. But now, his voice was a thread. And she was starting to follow it. She didn't speak much at first. Her voice was thin, like it had been left out in the cold too long. But he didn't mind the pauses. Didn't rush her. "What's the first thing you remember?" he asked once, when the storm howled loud enough to cover their words from the guards. She didn't answer immediately. Then, gold. He waited. Gold floors. Gold robes. Gold lies. And then, fire. He was quiet after that. She didn't blame him. Not many knew the truth of the fallen throne. It had been scrubbed from the maps, erased from the records. But once, long ago, she had ruled the shimmering isles of Kael'thar. Queen of tides and flame. The only daughter of the mirror-blooded. And she had lost it all. It wasn't just betrayal that ended her reign. It was curse. They had called it justice. But when her general, her closest friend, plunged the blade into her side and whispered the old words, Naira knew it wasn't justice. It was fear. Fear of her power. Fear of what she would become. They bound her magic in chains. Bound her spirit in silence. She'd screamed once, long ago. Screamed until her voice shattered. And then she stayed silent. For years. Until now. The ring she gave Aiden was more than metal. She had carved it from her own binding, just a sliver, but it was enough to share a part of herself. A thread of her true name, hidden within the twisting sigils. It didn't unbind the chains, but it loosened something else. Hope. And that was far more dangerous. The storm lasted for 3 days. By the second night, she could feel her pulse again. Warm. Humming in places she'd thought long dead. Magic wasn't like fire or wind. It was memory. And the more she remembered, the more it stirred. She began to feel the prison differently. The walls had a rhythm. The stones held echoes. She could trace the patterns in the frost as if reading forgotten runes. On the third night, she reached out. Just a whisper of power. The chain around her wrist sparked, blue, then violet, then hissed and went still. But it was enough. Enough to tell her she wasn't broken anymore. Just waiting. "What are you doing over there?" Aiden called softly. "Breathing." He chuckled. "I suppose that's a good start." "Aiden," she said, her voice steadier now. "Yeah. When the time comes, if I fall again." "You won't. But if I do, promise me you'll run." "Not a chance. You don't even know what I am." "You're Naira." She swallowed. That's enough, he added. She didn't cry. Queens weren't supposed to. But she pressed her palm to the cold stone, imagined his hand on the other side, and let herself feel it. Softness. For the first time in years. They planned the escape in whispers. Aiden had been mapping guard patterns with bits of stone. Naira added what she remembered of the old structure, hidden tunnels from before the prison became a tomb. I think I can break one chain, she said, showing him the sigil she'd carved into the floor. But only one. The rest, the magic's still too tangled. Then we break the rest together. You don't fear what I'll become? No, he said. But I think they should. The fourth night, the storm broke. And with it, the first shackle. A crack like thunder rang through her cell. The chain on her left wrist snapped, clattering to the floor like dead bone. She gasped. Heat rushed through her veins, sweet and terrible. Naira, Aiden called. She stood, swaying slightly. Looked down at her free hand. Flexed her fingers. Soon, she whispered. When the guard came the next morning, he noticed nothing. Naira sat in her corner, eyes closed. The chain on her left wrist was still there, at least, it looked like it. Illusion was one of the few things she still remembered how to do. And he was just another brute. No magic in him. No suspicion. He slid her food through the slot and turned away. That would be the last time he ever saw her in chains. Naira waited until nightfall. Then she whispered a single word in the old tongue. The chain illusion fell. Her arm pulsed with light. She crossed the cell silently and touched the wall. Aiden, she whispered. His voice came, half asleep. What is it? Tonight, she said. You're sure? Yes. The storm woke me. And now the fire inside me won't let me sleep. He exhaled, sharp and ready. Then let's burn this place down. As she traced the escape sigil on the back wall of her cell, Naira felt it. Not just her power. Not just his presence. But the spark of something old. Older than her fall. Older than her crown. A bond. Not made of duty. Not made of blood. But something born in the dark. Something strong enough to pull a queen out of silence. And into the fire again. The moment the wall cracked open, Aiden felt it. A strange tingle, like the air had suddenly thickened with the heat of 1,000 fires, the chill of 1,000 winters, and something else, something ancient. Naira's voice had been a whisper of wind, but this was different. This was real. He stood, his heart hammering, not from fear but something else, a rising thrill, a flicker of hope that could burn as bright and as hot as any forge fire. Ready? She asked, her voice steady despite the power surging through her. You know it. And then, as the final piece of the prison's outer wall shattered into dust, Aiden felt the night air rush in, sharp and cold, like a blade against his skin. Naira stepped out into the darkness first. Her form barely visible in the moonlight, her silhouette a strange mix of power and grace. She was free now, but there was something else in her eyes. She wasn't just the fallen queen anymore, she was something more, something other. Aiden followed, closing the gap between them. His breath fogged in the air, but his mind was focused on one thing, survival. And on the storm that had begun to rage around them. The storm. It felt like the wind was urging them onward, like it was willing them to escape. Or maybe it was her. Maybe it was her magic pulling the world into her wake. Where to? He asked as they made their way through the ruinous, frozen tunnels beneath the mountain. The mountain's peak, she said, her voice low. It's a place of power. If I can reach it, I can unlock what's left of my strength. I'll be able to do more, but I'll need the storm. Storm. The curse binds my magic, Aiden. But storms are different. They don't listen to the chains. They moved through the tunnels as quietly as they could, their steps soft against the snow and stone. The wind howled louder as they climbed, battering the cliffs with icy gusts. It felt as though the mountain itself was awake, alive and watching them. Aiden glanced at Naira, who was moving ahead with a purpose he couldn't fully understand. Something in the air had shifted, it wasn't just the storm. It was her. The flicker of power that had begun to reawaken when the chain snapped was now a steady pulse beneath her skin. Every step she took seemed to ripple through the ground itself. It was as if the world was adjusting to her presence, a presence that had been absent for far too long. They reached the peak of the mountain just as the storm reached its fever pitch. The wind screamed through the jagged rocks, but at the very top, there was a flat expanse, a clearing untouched by the fury of the weather. Aiden barely had time to catch his breath before he saw it, the ancient altar, covered in runes and symbols. It had been abandoned long before his time, forgotten by most, but Naira's eyes seemed to recognize it instantly. "Help me," she breathed. He nodded, rushing to her side, his heart beating faster than it had any right to. He wasn't a mage. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a blacksmith. But there was something about this moment, something about standing beside her, that made him feel like he could fight dragons, or walk through fire. "Place your hand here," she said, pointing to a stone pedestal in the center of the altar. The runes shimmered faintly beneath her touch as she placed her palm on the cold surface. Aiden hesitated, but he didn't question her. He placed his hand beside hers, and the moment they touched the stone, the air shifted again. This time, the storm quieted. The wind stilled, the snow stopped falling, and a pulse of heat surged through the air, a heat that didn't come from the flames of a fire. Naira gasped, her body shaking slightly as the energy coursed through her, and for the first time, Aiden saw something in her eyes, something that wasn't pain or fear, but strength. Power. She had always been a queen, but now she was reclaiming what was hers. The ground rumbled beneath them. Aiden's heart raced as the stone beneath their hands began to glow, brighter, brighter, until the light was blinding. He pulled his hand back instinctively, but Naira kept hers on the altar. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. "I can feel it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's coming back. All of it." And then, just as quickly as it had started, the light vanished, and the wind picked up again. But this time, it wasn't the wind of a storm. It was her wind. It was her magic. She took a deep, steadying breath, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer tentative. It was strong, commanding. "It's time," she said. The world began to move around them, the storm now roaring in response to her call. The mountain itself seemed to wake, the ground trembling with the force of her power. Aiden could barely believe what he was seeing. Naira's eyes burned with an intensity he had never seen before. Her hair whipped around her face, like fire carried by the wind. It was as though the very elements had bent to her will. "You're a queen," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Naira turned to him, a faint, knowing smile curving her lips. "Not yet." But the power surging through her now wasn't just about reclaiming her title. It was about something more. Something deeper. Aiden could feel it too, the bond between them had shifted again, becoming stronger. She was no longer just a queen. She was something else. Something born of fire and ice, of light and shadow. And somehow, he was a part of it. A part of her. "Are you ready?" she asked. He took a step forward, his hand tightening around the hilt of the sword he had taken from the prison guard. The blade wasn't much, not compared to the magic radiating from her, but it would have to do. "I was born ready," he said. She nodded, her face serious. "Then let's end this." The storm picked up again, but this time, it wasn't just a storm. It was their storm. Together, they would face what was coming. Together, they would burn away the past, and forge something new. The wind howled around them, but it was a different wind now. It no longer screamed in terror or despair. Now, it howled in defiance, in unity, in the wild pulse of life. Naira stood tall at the peak of the mountain, her body crackling with power. Every fiber of her being hummed with the force of the storm she had awakened. It had been a long time since she had felt this way, unstoppable, free. The chains that had bound her were gone now, and the echo of them was nothing but a shadow in her memory. Now, she was whole. Now, she was the storm. Beside her, Aiden was watching her intently, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he feared that if he looked away, the magic might disappear, or worse, she might crumble beneath it. But Naira was not a fragile thing. She was the fire that had burned her kingdom to the ground and the frost that had frozen her enemies in their tracks. And now she was going to burn the chains of her past to the ground, once and for all. "We're not running anymore," she said softly, more to herself than to Aiden. "This ends here." The storm rose in answer, thrashing the snow around them into a blinding whirl. The sky above was alive with lightning, a strange purple hue that crackled like the earth itself was breaking open. And in the heart of the storm, the first of her enemies appeared. They were not the guards from the prison. No, these were worse. Much worse. Shadow figures, their forms barely visible in the flickering storm, emerged from the swirling snow. Aiden's hand instinctively gripped his sword tighter, but Naira didn't flinch. Her magic was all-encompassing now, she didn't need a blade. "The time has come, daughter of Kael'thar," the voice rang out, deep and malevolent. It carried on the wind like an ancient curse. Naira turned to face the voice, her eyes cold, unblinking. She had known this day would come, knew at the moment the chains had been wrapped around her wrists. These were the ones who had sealed her fate, the ones who had betrayed her. They had come to finish the job. "How fitting," she said, her voice a low growl, "that it would be you. The cowardly puppets who thought they could bind a queen." The figures stepped forward, revealing themselves. They were not human. No, they were something darker, more twisted. Creatures forged from shadow and ancient bitterness. Their forms flickered in and out of existence like wraiths, barely tangible, yet their malice was as solid as stone. "You will kneel," the shadow leader spat, his form resolving into something almost human, but still unnatural, his eyes glowing with an unholy light. "You will beg for mercy." Naira's lips curled into a smile that was as cold as the winter winds howling around them. "I was born to rule," she said, her voice steady, the fury of her words carrying on the storm's winds. "You will not break me. And I will never kneel." With a flick of her wrist, the ground trembled beneath her. Her magic surged outward, like a tidal wave of pure energy. The wind and snow twisted, spinning with her commands, forming into sharp, icy tendrils. They shot toward the approaching wraiths, ripping through the air with the force of 1,000 storms. The wraiths shrieked as the ice pierced their shadowed forms, but they did not retreat. They fought back with shadows of their own, twisting the air, warping reality itself to slow her magic. It was an ancient battle, one that Naira had been born for, and one that she would finish. They could not understand the depth of the power she now controlled. They thought chains could hold her. They thought they could silence the storm in her veins. But they were wrong. "Fall," she commanded, and with that single word, the storm intensified. The sky cracked with lightning, and the mountain itself seemed to bend to her will. Her magic surged forth, a vortex of flame and frost, fire that burned hot enough to melt the very core of the earth, ice cold enough to freeze time itself. The first wraith crumbled to ash before she even moved a step. The second was torn apart by jagged shards of ice, frozen mid-scream as the storm tore through its body. One by one, the wraiths fell, their forms disintegrating like smoke in the wind, until only the leader remained. He stood tall, the air around him warping as he summoned more shadows to shield himself from her power. He growled low, his glowing eyes narrowing. "You will kneel," he hissed. "I will make you pay for this defiance." "You should have learned long ago," Naira said softly, her voice carrying above the wind, that I am not someone to be cowed. She lifted her hand, and the storm answered her call. The leader of the wraiths moved to strike, but before he could reach her, the earth beneath his feet split open, a crack that swallowed him whole. The shadows roiled, trying to hold him together, but it was no use. Nyra's magic was too much. No, the leader howled as the fissure in the earth consumed him. This is not over. But his voice was swallowed by the storm, and with one final roar, he was gone. The wind died down, and the storm began to fade, leaving behind only the cold silence of the mountaintop. Aiden, who had been watching from a distance, came to stand beside her. "You did it," he said, his voice full of awe. Nyra turned to him, her face still set in a grim line, though there was something more now, a softness, a relief. She had won, but the cost was not just the wraiths. It was everything. She had claimed her power, her throne, and now, she would be forever bound to this world, this life. "I didn't do it alone," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with something deeper. "It was you who believed in me when no one else would." He met her gaze, his expression filled with understanding. "I've always believed in you, Nyra." And in that moment, as they stood at the peak of the world, with nothing left to stop them, she finally understood. The chains that had bound her were gone. The throne of Kael'thar was hers once more, but there was one thing left to claim, and that was the life she would build, a life not bound by the past, but by the future. The future they would create together. The storm had faded, but the mountains still trembled beneath their feet. The sky, once dark and swirling with fury, had begun to clear, revealing the cold, unforgiving expanse of the world below. The world that had forgotten her. The world that would now know her name once more. Nyra stood at the peak, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind tugged at her hair, but she did not move. She did not need to. Everything was different now. The weight of her chains, the burden of the past, was gone. And with that freedom came the knowledge that she would never be the same again. Aiden stood beside her, his presence steady and unwavering. She could feel the warmth of his body next to hers, grounding her in this new world. She had not expected to need anyone. After all, she had been a queen, alone and isolated in her power. But now, with him beside her, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a connection, a bond that went deeper than mere survival. "It's over," Aiden said quietly, his voice low as if he too could sense the magnitude of what they had just done. Nyra nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. The storm had passed, but it had left behind a trail of destruction. The shadows were gone, but the scars of her people's betrayal remained. "It's not over yet," she replied, her voice steady but filled with determination. "This is just the beginning." "You're right," he said, his hand brushing against hers. "There's a world out there that needs you." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. There was a calmness in him now, a quiet understanding that had not been there before. He had seen her at her worst, when her power was nothing more than a shattered echo of what it had once been. But now, she was whole again. And with that wholeness, she could see him more clearly than ever before. "You're not afraid?" she asked, her voice softer now, the remnants of the battle still echoing in her words. Aiden smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "No, not anymore." Nyra's heart gave a sudden, unexpected jolt. She had never let anyone get close. She had never allowed anyone to see her as anything other than a weapon. But now, with Aiden beside her, she realized how much she had missed, how much she had longed for connection, for partnership. "Good," she said, her lips curving into a small smile of her own. "Because we have a long road ahead of us." Together, they turned and made their way down the mountain. The storm had passed, but its echoes would remain with them, a reminder of the power they had unleashed, the strength they had found within each other. As they descended, the world around them began to come alive again. The wind had softened, the snow falling more gently now, as if the mountain itself was acknowledging their victory. It would not be easy. Rebuilding would take time. The people who had once served her would need to see that she was not the broken, betrayed queen they had abandoned. She would show them that she was stronger than ever. And she would do it with Aiden at her side. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Naira felt the weight of uncertainty not as a burden, but as a challenge. A challenge she was ready to face. The journey would not be easy. There would be battles to fight, people to convince, and decisions to make that would shape the future of her kingdom. But she was no longer afraid. She had reclaimed her power. And now, she would reclaim her kingdom, piece by piece. They traveled together, through the bitter cold and the thawing warmth of spring. Aiden's presence was a constant source of strength for her, as she had become his. They had healed together, forged a bond stronger than steel in the fires of adversity. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Naira knew one thing with certainty: she would not face it alone. They reached the city gates as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light across the landscape. The city that had once been a home to her people now lay in ruins, the remnants of the old kingdom scattered in the rubble. But that would change. Naira would rebuild. She would make her people see that she was not just the queen they had once known, but a queen reborn. As they approached the gates, a group of her most loyal supporters stepped forward, their faces etched with uncertainty. They had heard the stories of her return, but they had also heard the whispers of her downfall. The city had been in chaos since her imprisonment, and it was clear that there was no simple path to healing. But when they saw her, their faces softened, their eyes filled with awe and reverence. "Naira," one of them whispered, almost as if it were a prayer. She nodded, her gaze steady. "It's time to rebuild," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "The storm is over. And now, we begin again." Aiden stepped forward beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. He was not just a man beside a queen anymore. He was her equal, her partner. And together, they would face the challenges of the future. The crowd fell silent, watching them, waiting for something. For a sign that the woman they had once known, the queen who had disappeared into the shadows, was truly back. And then, as the last rays of the setting sun touched the earth, Naira raised her hand. The ground beneath them began to hum with power, the echoes of the storm still lingering in the air. The magic that had once been bound by chains surged around her, wrapping itself around her body, around her soul. "This kingdom will rise again," she said, her voice clear, strong. "And it will rise with me." The people who had once doubted her now stood in awe, watching as the queen they thought lost returned in full force. And with her, they knew the future of their kingdom would be written in fire and frost, in light and shadow, a kingdom reborn from the ashes of its past.